I'm going to try to give some sort of overview of how ability damage is calculated in Runescape. It's a rather needlessly complicated process, so it might not be as clear. Hopefully I can explain well enough, but we will see. So to start with, we have what's called the base ability damage stat, which is actually visible in game if you go to the loadout tab and you click on abilities. You have your damage is equal to something, and then this will update if you switch gear, you change level, other weapons, that kind of stuff, and also with the eruptive and equilibrium aura perk. So on the wiki in ability damage, there is formulas for them. For every style, there's a different formula. They mostly look the same. The deal with ones are always the same. There's just sometimes you have to consider some sort of ammunition, or in the case of magic, a spell damage. They can be capped to a certain level. If we check the spells, for example, Smoke Rush here, it says damage goes up to level 60. So even if you have, for example, a FSOA, which is tier 95, it only does tier 60 damage. The Genesis shard is not on here yet, but what it does is it adds a flat amount of damage to your weapons. So it doesn't change the tier. If you have, for example, tier 100 FSOA, it doesn't change this tier to 100. Instead, what it does is the tier remains 95 and it just adds 70. No, 72. 14.4 times 5, 72 it adds. So there's no rounding there actually. Yeah, this rounding part took like 20 hours to figure out. And actually this rounding part causes dual wield and 2H AD, or base damage, to not be the same always, which is kind of annoying. The dual wield base damage is main hand plus offhand damage, and it is always the main hand AD that's counted. So if you have a melee main hand and a range offhand, it only counts the melee AD. And then this number can be increased. So you calculate this number, and then you apply eruptive and equilibrium. And what you do is you take the eruptive bonus damage. So it's just 0.5% per rank. So if you have equilibrium 2, which is the most common eruptive level to have, you take 1% and then you add it to equilibrium aura if you have it. So if you have equilibrium aura on, you would go to 13%, and then you multiply that number to the damage that you calculated, the base damage, and that's then the number that will be here. And this number is used to calculate every single thing in the game that says it does a percentage of your ability damage. So any spell that you have, like if you rack, it says 90 to 110% magic damage. Anything that does damage like this, so that ability is crackling, aftershock, poison, anything like this, it's skills based off of this number that you calculate like that. And it should be noted that conjures, whenever you spawn them, they actually snapshot this number at the moment that you spawn them. So if you spawn them with a lot of good necromancy gear on, you get very strong conjures, and then you can swap over to whatever mage gear, and as long as you keep them alive by having either a necromancy shield or a lantern on, they will remain with this same damage that you spawned them with. Of course, the first necromancer outfit, the up to 35% damage on auto attack doesn't no longer apply, but the base damage still applies. And then here, after we have calculated this number, we have these two sections. which is the scaling to hit chance. So any ability that scales to hit chance. So abilities that are not conjures or that Swift, Sunshine, and ZGS bleed. Every other ability scales to hit chance. So you just multiply with your hit chance or your damage potential, as it's called now. So if you have 50%, you multiply this number that you just calculated with Eruptive and Equilibrium. You multiply it by 50%. But this is an invisible sort of copy of the ability, so you cannot see it anywhere. And it's the same for these invisible ability damage buffs, which is mostly the Hex weapons, Scripture of a Mascot, Flow, Chaos War, Keras, and When Arrows. Those are the invisible buffs. They work the same, they apply on all abilities, including bleeds, except for the conjures and the Sun, Swift, ZGS. And then we go to a third category of buffs, which have different names, which is rather annoying. They have often been called on-cast buffs by players for a long time. But the previous buffs have also been called on-cast, which is a bit weird. Jagex have called them on hit, and they have started putting the terminology on hit in game right now, which is conflicting with the player terminology, so there's some sort of weird friction there. But everything that starts here at ability specific effects and ends here at store bloat damage is an effect that doesn't apply to bleeds or other damage over time effects. And so they're sort of just listed in whatever order. Also, what I said is not 100% true. Actually, this still applies to some damage over time effects. This still applies to damage over time effects. It's where we start here with style specific, that damage over time effects no longer get buffed. Ability specific effects is anything that modifies a single ability, right? So a bunch of stuff in Magic will affect how Combust works, or Concentrated Blast affect itself. Gives more damage every hit. There's a bunch of abilities like that. Smoke Tendrils is also like that. There's a bunch of abilities like Slaughter. When you walk, it does 2 or 3 times as much damage. A bunch of abilities do bonus damage to bounded targets. Necromancy has a few abilities like the double damage on autos or the Living Death that multiplies Finger of Death by 1.5. These kind of abilities get affected here. So just whatever ability is affected. There's no generalization there. And then here it also marks that no damage is split into fixed and variable component, and this is sort of a technical point of how you calculate damage. So up to this point you have sort of that one number that you have calculated, or you have a visible and an invisible version of that number, but now you split it into fixed and variable. And if you go into the game, we take Racket again as an example, you see it's at 90 to 110% damage. What this actually means is at least you'll do 90% damage, and then there's a 20% variable component. And then you add those, and because of rounding it's not quite the same as 90 to 110, which actually means if you equip weapons, it will say like a number, like it says like 155 to 190, but it's not always correct because of this rounding. And then actually all the buffs that we get here up to this up to here, roll damage, they apply separately to the minimum or the fixed portion and the variable portion. So you just gotta think we have 2 different numbers, and at the end we combine them back again. I don't know why it's split here and not sometime later, but whatever. So then we get style specific stuff. It's really only range that has anything here, and it's just the ammo. Right, all the ranged ammo stuff and the Pernix Quiver apply here. Well, not all the ranged ammo, the when arrows applied earlier. right, 4 arrows, whatever. So if you have 4 arrows on, you multiply the fixed portion of your damage by 1.15 and the variable portion of your damage by 1.15, and that's it. The same goes for any other arrows. If you get an Onyx Bolt proc, I think it's 25%, so you multiply both by 1.25. Then after that, you will apply the precise perk, right? So it says reduce max damage. So what it actually does is reduces the variable portion of your damage by a certain percent of your maximum hit. So maximum hit is then defined as minimum plus variable, and then it can never bring the variable portion under 0%, or under 0, just the number 0, not percent. And it will increase your min hit. So you can't somehow get max below min or whatever. Then we have additive buffs. Additive buffs are very weird. So up till now, actually that's not true. A lot of the buffs in RuneScape skill multiplicatively. So if you have 2 buffs, you multiply one and then you multiply the other. So if you get 2 buffs of 10%, you get 1.1 times 1.1, which is 1.21. But for additive buffs, if you have 2 buffs of 10%, what you do is you calculate 10% plus 10%, which is 20%, and then you multiply your damage by 20%. So you actually get less of a buff if the numbers are the same. It's just like we had with Eruptive and Equilibrium, which are additive. You add them together and then you multiply, which is slightly worse than if you just multiplied both separately. And these additive buffs, they exist for some reason. There's not so many left. Fall Book is the most notable one. Berserk used to be under this until the March 2024 beta update. I believe that Needle Strike is still in here. Yeah, Gloves of Passage on hit buff is the same as Needle Strike. So if you Needle Strike with Full Book on, you get 27% instead of 1.2 times 1.07, or the other way around. So it's just, these buffs apply additively. Don't know why, don't think Jagex knows why, they just do. And then the next buffs apply multiplicatively again, and you can see we've split it up into PvE, PvP, and PvE only. This is more of a technicality than an actual difference. If you only care about PvP, then this section is irrelevant for you. And then we have just sort of nicely split it up into all the effects. Nothing special happening here. You multiply them one by one. Because of Jagex's weird scripting thing, you have to round after everything, but they do a weird thing where they take a 10,000 scalar, you multiply all the buffs into that 10,000, they apply the 10,000 to your main hit, and then you scale down. So you divide by 10,000 and then you scale. I don't know why they do it. It's I mean, I know why they do it, but it doesn't make it easier. It's a bit needlessly complex if you ask me. It's all about these sort of one-off errors. Maybe if the system was just understandable enough, they didn't need to do it, but whatever. So you have buffs that apply to both PvE and PvP, and then there's a bunch of PvE buffs. Same thing here, you just multiply them one by one, again to a 10,000 scalar. Right, so you have genocidal, you have self-amulet, you apply them both. You calculate genocidal first, it goes up to like 5% now, I think, I don't remember. And then after that you go self-amulet, so that you apply 15 or 20% depending on which one you have. Done. And then here we get to the core. The core is a bit more interesting. Obviously every ability rolls damage. So you just decide, like, you know, I have a min hit of X, I have a variable hit of Y, so I want to get X plus a number between 0 and Y. And then you just tell the code is like, okay, well, you get this number, whatever. And then we apply more buffs for some reason. I don't know why. Berserker's Fury, the relic. If you're not using the Daruk's Memento, I think it's called, the necklace, that one also happens. And then we store damage into bulk get into that in a second. Then we apply crit damage. Crit damage is again an additive boost, so you add up all your crit damage buffs, which is only the Rex Rings, Smoke Cloud, and the base up to 50% damage. There's not so many, but if they would add more, they apply additively. They're slightly worse than if they're multiplicatively again. And they restore bloat damage. I'll get into that as well. Now, I'm quite certain, but I don't think it matters, that bleeds actually sent their fixed and variable to the NPC or to the other player if you're fighting another player. And then when they hit the NPC, that's when they set their damage. So that's when they roll damage. But it doesn't really matter. And then to get into this store damage into bulk, basically what the game does is it says, hey, we need to do a bulk proc here. This is how much damage I want you to do. And then it does the rest of the calculations for the hit. So in this case, it does crit damage calculations. And then when it fires the bulk hit, it takes this damage and then bulk scales to this damage, right? So it's like 33 to 37% of this damage. And then it puts bulk into... now I need to remember. So calculates bulk. So it has this base value that's calculated like this, right? This, I think it's 12 to 16% ability damage plus 35-ish% of the hit. So it calculates the ability damage, and then here when we get to ability specific effects in range, what it does is combines them. So it's calculated some sort of damage, you know, whatever, do 320 damage plus 3000 damage, which was however much damage based on, you know, whatever we deboed, and we got 3000 damage bulk proc from that. So then we add these two together, so we get 3350 or whatever I said. And then we go through the entire thing again. All the buffs, same way for the bulk proc. And then the bulk proc gets some sort of damage, and then it can crit itself. So a crit proc that gives a bulk proc does not do any more damage than a non-crit. Of course it does more damage because the hit itself does more damage, but the bulk proc will not do more damage than if the original hit didn't crit. And then here we have store bloat damage. Bloat hits for a certain amount of damage. And then it does a quarter of that damage as a bleed. So if it does 2000 damage, it will also do a 500 damage bleed. And it is decided after crit. So if your bloat crits, the bleed also does more damage. So bloat is sort of a special bleed ability because it can crit. Of course, you don't get actual crit splats, so there's no way to get crit at Dren or anything. But crit damage does apply, so you do get benefits from crits if you bloat. Now then here, so all these abilities that we have just computed, they are all calculated on the cast tick. Whenever there's a tick on which you cast the ability. And then here we get this on-NPC section, and this is actually all calculated on a tick that the NPC land, or that the hit lands on the NPC or the other player or whatever you're fighting. And that means that these buffs only apply if they're active at the moment that the hit lands. So obviously, like I just said 2 times the same thing, but that means that if you have an effect or slot or something that consumes not consumes, but that takes up a slot on the cast tick, and it gives a boost on the cast tick, and you replace it by something that takes up a slot on the hit tick, and then you make this replacement, then you can get both effects. This is quite common. People have probably heard of Grimshawing, where you use Grim on the cast tick and then you switch to the Scrimshaw to get both effects. This is probably the most common version of it, But we see here the Essence of Corruption bonus. This one is actually similar. If you do for example, you do a 4-tick auto, right? You do auto and on the bill, you switch to your wanted orb from the Sanctum weapons. You still get the bonus damage effect, assuming you have 25 plus stacks, because they happen on the tick that the hit lands on the NPC. Now there's a list here again. They're multiplicative. If you multiply one by the other, of course, good to notice that the Berserker auras, if Sunshine, Metamorphosis, Dead Swiftness, or Berserk ability ultimates are up, then they're deactivated, or this part of the buff is deactivated. But this is also a great example of one of the things where if the ult is active on the cast stick, you get the effect. And then if the ult runs out, that means that the aura comes back on, which means that you can get the aura buff. So if you cast something on the last tick of your ultimate, you can get both effects on the same ability. It's a very common thing to do. But it goes for a bunch of stuff. We can see Necklace of Salamancy as well. There's a good example. There's a bunch of slots, necklace slot items, Self Amulet or Essence of Fidelity. They give much better stats. At least Essence of Finality give much better stats, or even Amulet of Souls or whatever you're using gets much better stats. So if you use it on your cast stick, you get a higher base damage. And if you swap to your Necklace of Salamancy to get the extra 15% boost, so you can get both effects. It's the same for the Self Amulet. It applies on the cast stick. We saw it a little bit up. So you can get that effect, then you can go into the Necklace of Salamancy, then you can get a 20% boost, you can get an extra 10% boost. You can get a lot of extra damage. Unfortunately, it's totally irrelevant with one boss, which is AFKable with like charity gear, but these kind of things can happen a lot. And we see Zamorak, Lord of Chaos, says Balance of Power is one of the edicts. I'm fairly sure there's a bunch of unknown locations here. I'm pretty sure that every boss thing applies here after Haunted. So there too, right? I think the Zami's Lord of Chaos has one of these things that's like if you go under 60% HP, then you get a bonus damage buff thing. So if you cast it whilst you're above 60% HP and it lands when you go under 60%, it works. And then probably the last good note to make here is that we have Haunted damage here. So it gets stored at the beginning, but then it gets added at the end. So none of these buffs here affect Haunted in any way whatsoever. But the buffs that come after Haunted, they can increase Haunted's damage. So the Essence Corruption tab is just a flat number boost, so it doesn't matter. But the Necklace of Salamancy, it's boost 10%, right? So if your ability does 100 damage, boost 10%, you go up to 110. But if Haunted adds 10 damage, then you will do, okay, well my ability is now 100 plus 10 is 110. Now I need to apply Salamancy, which is a 10% boost on 110 is 11 damage, so we go up to 121. Obviously, it's not so interesting if the damage is so low, but if you have higher damage numbers, that's much more interesting. Now, these On-NPC buffs, they also apply to bleeds again, they apply to conjures, they apply to pretty much everything. Of course, there are restrictions, right? Like Moderate Aura only applies to ranged melee magic and necrotic damage, not to spirit damage, not to poison damage or whatever. But in general, everything applies. So it's a rather... The entire thing is rather complicated. You can check out the RS Analysis website's GitHub page to get a little bit more of a feeling if you know how to read some code. It's written basically in order of application. I just wanted to get this out there to give a little bit of a documentation of what is going on. And I guess if there's any sort of questions, or if people believe that I have made a mistake somewhere, then feel free to shoot me a message either on Discord or on YouTube, where there should be. My Discord is Akrasia, same name as on YouTube, so you can find me quite easily. I'm pretty much always available in PVME Discord or in the RS Analysis Discord. If you just tag me, I will see it the next time I log into Discord. So thank you very much for listening to this absolutely fascinating part of RuneScape that nobody cares about.